Chapter 1. It began with a scent. The Grand Mirabelle Hotel stood like a jewel on the edge of Lake Lucerne, an opulent retreat for Europe's elite, nestled between snow-capped peaks and mirrored waters. But by the second day of May, the air was thick not with mountain freshness, but whispers. Guests avoided one particular suite. Staff exchanged glances. And in the salon, Hercule Poirot stirred a single cube of sugar into his coffee, his eyes on the staircase. From above, a commotion. Then came the voice, tight, clipped, shaken. "Doctor! Someone fetch a doctor! Madame Vernier is not waking!" Moments later, chaos unfolded on the second floor. The famed French opera singer, Celestine Vernier, had been found in her suite. Reclining on a fainting couch, eyes shut, skin pale. A crystal perfume bottle lay shattered on the carpet beside her. The room was locked from the inside. No sign of forced entry, no struggle, just the fading trace of rose oil and the stillness of a woman who had sung for emperors. Poirot, of course, was already moving. The hotel's manager, a sweating man named Albrecht Denner, intercepted him halfway up the stairs. "Monsieur Poirot, your discretion, please. We cannot afford scandal." Poirot offered a thin smile. "Monsieur Denner, I assure you, I do nothing without precision, and precision, it seems, is required here." Inside Suite 7, the scene resembled a painting. Velvet curtains drawn just enough to let in a shaft of golden morning light. A breakfast tray untouched. A single red rose wilting in a vase, and Celestine Vernier draped across her lounge as if awaiting applause. Poirot's sharp eyes took in everything. First, the scent. The rose perfume had not merely been spilled, it had been poured. Too much for a simple accident. It clung to the curtains, the upholstery, and most powerfully to the crushed petals of the real rose in the vase. "Curious," Poirot muttered, crouching to examine the fragments of glass. The bottle shattered, but on a thick rug. Why such violence, and yet no noise heard? The hotel physician arrived, breathless, and moved to examine the woman. "Heart failure," he announced after a moment. She was delicate, perhaps too much excitement, or... He hesitated. Perhaps she fainted and struck her head. Poirot did not reply. He stared at the woman's right hand, which rested delicately on her lap. A ring was missing. The skin pale where it had been. The mark fresh. "Ah," he said softly. "Someone has taken something that did not belong to them." From the doorway, a new voice. Soft, steady, and edged with disbelief. "She was fine last night. We drank wine together in the salon." A woman in a lavender suit stepped forward, tall, composed, and unmistakably English. Her name, Poirot would later learn, was Beatrice Lytton, a painter who had recently become fast friends with the singer. She folded her arms and looked not at the body, but at Poirot. "You think this was murder, monsieur?" "I think," said Poirot, standing, "that when a woman lies dying with the scent of roses in her hair, and a rose dies with her, one must ask if the beauty was too perfect to be true." He stepped back and gestured to the bottle fragments. "No suicide, no accident. Someone wished for her silence, and they arranged it with elegance." Behind him, Hastings, who had joined him for a short holiday, finally broke his silence. "But, Poirot, the door was locked, The window barred. How could anyone have come or gone? Poirot's eyes narrowed. Ah, mon ami, that is precisely the question. And it is a question I intend to answer, before another rose is plucked too soon. Chapter 2. The breakfast room of the Grand Mirabelle was unusually quiet that morning. Conversations were stifled into whispers. Newspapers remained unopened. Outside, the lake glistened under a pale sun, but within the walls of the hotel, invisible frost had settled. Poirot sat at his table, immaculate in a dove-grey suit with a violet handkerchief folded precisely in his pocket. Across from him, Captain Hastings stirred his tea with unnecessary vigour. I must say, Poirot, the whole thing is giving me a most unpleasant feeling. It's all so theatrical. A woman like Celestine Vernier doesn't just collapse without reason. Poirot sipped his chocolate. Precisely, mon ami. You feel disturbed not because the tragedy occurred, but because it occurred with such poise, as though someone wished it to be remembered, as a tableau. Hastings frowned. You think it's staged? I think, Poirot said, gently placing his cup down, that death often reveals what life conceals. And Madame Vernier, she was surrounded by admirers, but how many did she truly trust? He glanced around the room with a casual air, but his gaze catalogued every face. A man in a navy blazer watched the lake through the window with rigid posture. A silver-haired woman whispered urgently to her companion. And at a table near the fireplace, Beatrice Lytton sat alone, her breakfast untouched. Poirot stood. Come, Hastings, let us take a promenade. I would speak with Mademoiselle Lytton. She looked up as they approached, eyes wary but dry. Monsieur Poirot, she said with a nod, you wish to ask me about last night. Only if you are willing to speak. Mademoiselle, I do not interrogate, I listen. Hastings pulled out a chair. Poirot remained standing. You were close to Madame Vernier. A pause. Then, as close as anyone could be, I suppose. She was guarded. But we shared late-night conversations, walks by the lake. She was exhausted lately, nervous, jumpy. Did she speak of enemies? Beatrice hesitated, brushing a napkin against her lips. She feared someone from her past. She never said a name, only, he shouldn't have found me here. I thought she was being dramatic. Poirot's brow lifted, and last night we sat in the lounge until 11. She had 2 glasses of claret, seemed calm. Then she retired. Beatrice's eyes dropped to her plate. I heard nothing after that. Poirot tilted his head. But someone must have. Mademoiselle, forgive the intrusion. Do you recall exactly what she was wearing when you parted? Beatrice blinked. Her burgundy dressing robe. Silk, I think. She always wore it in the evenings. Merci. They moved away. Hastings glanced at Poirot. Why ask about her robe? Because, mon ami, Madame Vernier was found in a pale blue negligée, not the burgundy. Someone changed her clothing after she died. That, Hastings, is not the act of a woman retiring peacefully. It is the act of someone curating a scene. In the hallway, the hotel's chambermaid appeared. Young, red-cheeked, flustered. Excusez-moi, monsieur. I was told to give this to you. She handed Poirot a folded note, Suite 7. The rose was not hers, no signature. The handwriting was shaky, feminine, rushed. Poirot turned to the girl. Who gave this to you? I found it in the linen trolley this morning, monsieur, hidden under fresh towels. He nodded slowly. Merci, mademoiselle. One more question. Did Madame Vernier receive visitors last night? She wrung her hands. Only the bellboy. He brought her a glass of warm milk just after midnight. I saw him go in. Did he stay? Her eyes widened. No, monsieur. He left within seconds. Poirot gave a gentle smile. You are very observant. As the maid vanished down the corridor, Hastings leaned in. Someone left that rose deliberately? Poirot nodded, studying the note again. Celestine was known for her jasmine scent. The rose perfume was not hers. Someone wished to frame the scene with a different identity, one that did not belong to the victim. They turned toward the stairs. Just then, a loud crash echoed from above. A tray dropped, a voice shouting, another figure running. Poirot stilled. A disturbance, he said quietly. And not the last, I fear. Chapter 3. The sound of the crash had summoned a ripple of motion across the Grand Mirabelle. Staff rushed upstairs. Guests emerged from rooms half-dressed in curiosity or concern, and the corridor outside Suite 7 became a parade of whispers. Poirot, ever calm, stepped aside to allow the bellboy to pass. His face flushed, his hands trembling, as he struggled to steady the breakfast cart, now missing a tray. "It slipped, monsieur," the boy stammered. I saw someone at the top of the stair, a shadow. Then nothing. It startled me. Poirot placed a hand lightly on the lad's arm. Take a breath. You are not under suspicion for clumsiness. He smiled. But do tell me, was it a man or a woman? The boy hesitated, then whispered, A woman, I think. But she moved quickly. I saw only the hem of a robe, pale, like smoke. Poirot exchanged a glance with Hastings. And did you deliver warm milk to Madame Vernier last night? The boy's expression shifted. Yes, monsieur. She rang just before midnight. Asked for it with cinnamon. Poirot's gaze narrowed. Did she seem unwell? No. Tired, maybe. She barely looked at me. Did anyone else visit her room after you left? The boy hesitated. I passed a man in the hallway, near the stairwell. He was smoking, didn't say a word, but he wore dark glasses. At midnight, monsieur. Poirot's voice was soft. Midnight is rarely the hour for anonymity, unless one wishes to remain unseen. Merci. As the boy left, Poirot turned. Come, Hastings. We shall begin our little interviews. They chose the veranda, a place of polite distance, with a view of the lake and no walls to conceal tension. Denner, the hotel manager, had been instructed to send guests down one by one. The first to arrive was Madame Adela Romilly, a guest of notable wealth and less notable tact. Draped in layers of cream lace and pearls, she resembled a piece of antique furniture, valuable, ornate, and wholly inflexible. Poirot gestured for her to sit. Madame, you were acquainted with Madame Vernier? Hardly, she scoffed. I do not consort with actresses. I believe in breeding, not spectacle. And yet you were seen speaking with her on several occasions, Poirot said mildly. She blinked. I may have exchanged pleasantries. She was always too friendly. Poirot tilted his head. You were present in the lounge last night? Yes, until 10:30. I play bridge on Tuesdays. I left with Colonel Beauchamp. And you did not hear anything later? No raised voices, no disturbances? Madame Romilly smirked. My hearing is excellent. The only thing I heard was the sound of vulgar laughter from room 10. Some people forget this is a hotel, not a tavern. Poirot smiled politely and dismissed her. As she swept away, Hastings leaned closer. Charming woman. Poirot's smile widened slightly. She lies about very little, but omits rather much. The next guest was Colonel Desmond Beauchamp, tall, moustached, and carrying a silver-tipped cane that seemed more ornamental than necessary. I trust I can be of service, he said, voice gravelly with age and confidence. I heard about poor Madame Vernier. Awful business. You knew her? By reputation, not intimacy. I found her dramatic. She had the eyes of a woman who knows too much about passion. Were you in the lounge last night? Indeed. Left shortly after 10:30 with Madame Romilly. I retired directly. The corridors were empty. Did you see anyone lingering? The Colonel frowned. Perhaps the steward, or that Italian fellow, De Luca, always slinking about. Poirot raised a brow. Signor De Luca. Charming chap, but slippery. You'll find he spends a great deal of time listening to doors rather than knocking on them. He stood to leave. Poirot made no motion to stop him. Another name, Hastings muttered. This De Luca, what's his story? We shall ask, Poirot replied, eyes on the lake. But I suspect his name is being offered because it is convenient. The third interview was with Emilia De Luca. Not a gentleman at all, but a striking woman in her 30s, draped in bold colours and darker glances. Her presence was commanding, her smile selective. I understand you've been asking about me, she said, taking the seat without being offered. Colonel Beauchamp always did have a suspicious mind. Poirot inclined his head. Then let me ask directly. Were you in contact with Madame Vernier? We spoke a few times. Ascham was fascinating. Tragic women often are. But no, I was not one of her close circle. Were you out last night? I was in the lounge until 11. Then I returned to my suite. Poirot folded his hands. And did you see anyone lingering in the hallway? Eyes sparkled. Only the Colonel. He dropped his handkerchief near the stairs. I gave it back to him. Hastings frowned, but he said he went straight to bed. Emilia gave a feline smile. People lie, Captain, or they forget. She rose, her perfume lingering faintly. As she left, Poirot tapped his fingers on the table. 3 interviews, 3 versions of truth, all plausible, all slightly misaligned. Hastings exhaled. You think one of them's the killer? Poirot's voice dropped. I think the killer is watching these interviews very carefully, wondering when I will ask the right question. A shadow moved behind a curtain across the veranda, gone before Hastings could turn. Poirot's gaze didn't follow it. His attention remained on the rose bushes blooming beneath the window of Suite 7. There, he said softly. That rose. It was not there yesterday. Chapter 4. The rosebush beneath Suite 7 had not bloomed the day before. Poirot was certain of it. He descended the stone steps leading into the side garden, Hastings following with a puzzled look. The flower in question, a deep red rose, unnaturally vivid, leaned slightly towards the glass-panelled window above, almost as if eavesdropping. It must have opened overnight, Hastings offered, crouching beside it. "Odd time for a rose, but these mountain climates can be peculiar." Poirot frowned. "Yes, and yet this particular rose is not rooted." He reached out delicately, fingers brushing the stem. With the gentlest pull, the flower came free, its base trimmed, not torn, a florist's cut, not part of the bush, but placed there, nestled among the living blooms as if it belonged. "Someone staged this," Poirot murmured. "A message, or a memory." He examined the petals, dewy, unblemished. Tucked inside, nearly invisible, was the corner of a torn page. Hastings leaned in. "Is that paper?" Poirot extracted it with tweezers from his pocket. A sliver of cream-coloured stationery. The edge bore a faint trace of ink, just enough to read one word: promise. Poirot folded the fragment into his wallet without comment. As they returned to the veranda, Denner approached, nervous energy rolling off him in waves. "Monsieur Poirot, I must speak with you. There's been a complication." He led them toward his office, bypassing the curious glances of staff and guests alike. Inside, behind a polished walnut desk, sat a velvet pouch. Denner opened it and tipped its contents onto a handkerchief. A ring, not just any ring. A striking oval ruby, encased in diamonds. The metal band bore an engraving. "À toi, toujours, Poirot," did not speak. He simply looked. "This was found behind the piano in the salon," Denner explained, "by the night porter during cleaning. He brought it to me first thing this morning." "And Madame Vernier?" Poirot asked softly. "She wore it constantly," Denner said, "always on her right hand. The press will destroy us if they think one of our guests stole from a dead woman." Poirot lifted the ring, turning it toward the light. The ruby was flawless, the engraving heartfelt. But there, on the inner curve, was a faint residue, a greenish tint. Poirot's expression darkened. "Hastings," he said, "this ring was handled recently by someone wearing gloves with copper salts, possibly gardening gloves. You think the killer hid it behind the piano?" Hastings asked. Poirot gave a small shake of the head. "No, mon ami. I think the killer meant for us to find it." Later that afternoon, Poirot requested the return of Amelia de Luca for a second conversation. She arrived in the garden terrace, parasol in hand, her expression unreadable. "Madame de Luca," Poirot began gently, "were you aware that Madame Vernier once performed under a different name?" Amelia's eyebrow lifted. "I wasn't, though it wouldn't surprise me. Stars often leave something behind." "And did you know she was once engaged to a diplomat in Milan, whose brother died under questionable circumstances? I didn't." "But you were born in Milan, were you not?" Amelia's smile didn't reach her eyes. "You've been doing your homework." "Indeed," Poirot said, "because someone is rewriting history here. The red rose in the garden, the altered clothing, and now the sudden discovery of this ring." He placed it on the table before her. The ruby caught the sunlight and pulsed red. She stared at it for a moment, then looked away. "I never saw that before." Poirot leaned forward. "But someone wanted you to see it now." Amelia looked up sharply. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Poirot said, "the clues are not leading to a person, they are being pushed toward one." Evening, Poirot requested to revisit Suite 7. Denner handed him the passkey without argument. The room remained as it had been, carefully preserved. Poirot stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Hastings followed, cautious. Poirot moved directly to the vanity. The perfume bottle's remnants had been collected, but the scent lingered. The bottle was called La Rose de Minuit. Poirot murmured, "An expensive blend, yet it was nearly full. Celestine never wore it, and still someone used it to stage her final act." He turned to the wardrobe. Inside, garments hung in careful order, until Poirot reached the end. There, tucked beneath a satin gown, was a pair of gloves. Not the lace gloves Celestine had often worn, but sturdy, practical leather ones. The fingertips bore minute traces of pollen, the kind used to hand-trim flowers. "And now," Poirot said, "we have the final stroke of the scene." He held them up, then paused. A shadow fell across the hallway outside. A second later, footsteps, quick, light, fleeing. Poirot opened the door just as the corner of a pale skirt vanished around the bend. "A visitor," he murmured. Hastings peered into the empty corridor. "Should we follow?" "No, Hastings. Let her run, for now. The net is not yet fully woven." Poirot looked back into the suite. Chapter 5. The next morning brought an unseasonable fog that curled along the lake like whispered regret. The Grand Mirabelle's usual elegance seemed subdued, its marble floors echoing with quieter steps, its staff more careful with glances. The fog, Poirot noted, had a curious effect. It blurred outlines, softened edges, and gave the impression that truth itself might dissolve if not held firmly in place. He and Hastings were in the reading room, a space more suited to hushed gossip than literature. Poirot ran a fingertip along the spine of a travelogue, then turned. "Do you recall the note, Hastings? The one hidden in the rose? The one that said the rose was not hers? Yes, you believe it came from someone close to her." Poirot nodded, as someone who knew Madame Vernier's habits intimately, and someone who feared the false trail enough to try and undo it. Before Hastings could reply, Beatrice Lytton entered the room. Her lavender suit had been exchanged for muted greys, and though her hair remained perfectly styled, there was something fractured in the way she carried herself. Too stiff, too careful. Poirot stepped forward with a gentle bow. "Mademoiselle Lytton, might I impose upon your kindness once more?" Her lips parted as if to refuse, but then, resigned, she nodded. "Very well. I've little else to offer this morning." They sat beneath the tall windows. The fog outside pressed against the panes. "You and Madame Vernier," Poirot began, "shared more than a few conversations, I believe." Beatrice looked down at her gloves. "We met 3 years ago. In Aix. She was performing. I was painting, or trying to. I admired her, of course. How could anyone not? She had a way of holding silence that made it feel like a performance." Poirot leaned in slightly. "And yet, in silence, we also hide. Did she ever speak of a man named Allard? The effect was immediate, her breath caught. I don't know that name," she said too quickly. Poirot's voice remained calm. "No? That is curious, because a letter recovered from her room was addressed to my dearest Beatrice, and mentioned Allard's threats. It was unsigned, torn, as if someone meant to destroy it." Beatrice's jaw trembled. She removed her gloves with slow fingers, folding them on her lap. "We were more than friends," she said softly. "It wasn't physical. It didn't have to be. I admired her strength. And she saw something in me no one else did. We were tethered. But Allard, he was from before. A man she left. He had money, yes, but also power. She said he used to send her roses when he wanted control. Even after she disappeared from Paris, the roses followed." Poirot exchanged a glance with Hastings. "And did Allard know she was here?" Beatrice hesitated. "I don't know. She believed he might. That's why she was frightened. That's why she wore the ruby ring. It had been a gift from someone else, someone she trusted. A talisman, she called it. But lately, she seemed afraid even of that." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "You never asked her why?" Beatrice looked away. She would only say, "Everything lovely turns on you in the end." And once she said that the worst betrayal came wrapped in affection. Poirot stood. "Thank you, mademoiselle. I believe you have told me more than you know." As she left the room, Hastings turned to him. "You think this Allard fellow found her again?" "I think," Poirot said quietly, "that someone from her past returned. Not necessarily Allard himself, but someone connected. And they wanted us to believe she died tragically, romantically, as opera stars often do. Later that day, Poirot requested the hotel's guest ledger for the previous week. At first glance, nothing unusual appeared. Names, dates, room numbers. But in the margins beside one entry, a faint smudge of ink caught his eye. M. Drouet. Room 9, he tapped the name. Drouet was the name of the man who once managed Madame Vernier's bookings in Paris. Quiet, forgettable, vanished after a scandal. Coincidence? Hastings asked. Rarely, Poirot murmured. He moved down the corridor, passing by room 9. The door was ajar. Inside, the maid was changing the linens. "Pardon, mademoiselle," Poirot said. "Did the guest in this room check out?" The maid nodded. "Yes, monsieur. Early this morning. Left no forwarding address." Poirot scanned the room. Everything was clean, except near the wastebasket, beneath the edge of the writing desk, lay a matchbook. He picked it up. The front bore the name of a Parisian café, Le Cygne Noir. Inside, a single unused match remained. On the stem, scrawled in microscopic script, were 3 initials, B.L.V. He turned it over. The number 27 was etched into the paper cover. "Madame Vernier's birth date," Poirot said quietly. 27th of April. Hastings leaned closer. "Why write that on a matchbook?" Poirot didn't answer. His expression had changed, more still than usual, the kind of stillness that always preceded revelation. "Come, Hastings," he said at last. "It is time we spoke to the one person who has yet to answer the question they pretend not to hear." Hastings furrowed his brow. "Who do you mean?" Poirot's eyes glittered. "The maid." Chapter 6. The maid's name was Lisette Marchand, a petite woman with milk-pale skin and anxious hands. Poirot found her folding linen in the service hall near the west stairwell, away from the main bustle of the hotel. When she saw him approach, her lips pressed into a practised smile. One too quick, too rehearsed. "Bonjour, Monsieur Poirot. I already answered questions for the manager yesterday." "Oui, mademoiselle," Poirot said gently. "But I ask different questions, and I notice different answers." He gestured to a bench nearby. She hesitated before sitting, smoothing her apron as if to distract herself. Poirot did not begin with an accusation. Instead, "You were the one who found the note, were you not? Hidden in the linen cart. The rose was not hers. That was not written by a stranger, Lisette. It was placed where it would be found, by you." Her breath caught. She looked down at her hands. "I didn't write it, monsieur." "No, but you know who did." Silence, then a whisper. "She asked me to hide it, not to keep it, just to let someone find it, someone who would understand." Poirot nodded slowly. "And who was she?" Lisette hesitated for too long. "I never knew her real name. She only gave me letters to deliver. To Madame Vernier." Poirot's voice remained calm. "And how long had you been delivering these letters?" 3 weeks, monsieur. They were always left under the service door by room 10, folded tight, no envelope. Poirot exchanged a glance with Hastings. "Room 10 belongs to Madame Romilly, does it not?" Lisette shook her head. "It's her suite, yes, but she wasn't always there." Poirot's brow lifted. "Then who was?" The maid hesitated again, this time longer. "A man. I saw him twice. Once early morning, slipping out the staff door. Another time, just before midnight, the night before Madame Vernier died." "And did Madame Vernier ever respond to these letters?" Lisette's face twitched. "Only once. She gave me a ribbon, red silk, said to leave it under the rose bush." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And did you?" She nodded. "Yes, but the next morning it was gone." He stood, his voice quiet. "Merci, mademoiselle. You've been most helpful." As they stepped away, Hastings muttered, "So someone used the maid to pass secret messages. That suggests planning. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act." "Indeed," Poirot murmured. "This was no crime of passion, Hastings. It was a composition, a performance carefully written, down to its final note." They stepped into the hallway, but Poirot slowed. "We must return to the scene. Alone." 7 felt colder now, as if its silence had congealed. Poirot closed the door and walked slowly through the room, not searching, but feeling. His gaze drifted to the mirror above the vanity. "There is a deception here," he said softly. "Not merely of identity, but of time." He walked to the window and opened it. The rosebush below swayed faintly in the wind. The red silk ribbon, no longer there. "Hastings," he said suddenly, "tell me, what was the official time of death?" "Between midnight and 1, Hastings replied. "According to the hotel, Doctor," Poirot gestured toward the shaving kit on the vanity. "And yet the brush is still dry, the soap unused. Does that strike you as odd?" "She didn't rise early." "Ah, but she was a woman of performance. Her habits were fixed, always grooming, always poised. She would not begin the day unprepared, even in private." He turned to the bedside table. A small travel clock sat there. Poirot picked it up. "It reads 7:45, and it is stopped." "Battery's gone?" Hastings guessed. "It is not a battery clock, mon ami. It is a wind-up, and someone has set it back deliberately." Hastings frowned. "To create confusion. Worse, to alter the timeline." Poirot walked slowly to the wardrobe again. The gloves, still resting atop a silk blouse, now seemed even more suspicious. He held them in his hands, then sniffed. Garden gloves, he confirmed. And faintly, rose oil. Hastings furrowed his brow. So someone handled the perfume with these, or handled the victim after the perfume was applied. He turned sharply, his voice gaining edge. "Do you see now? The scent, the robe, the ring, all manipulated. And most importantly, the time of death falsified. Madame Vernier may have died earlier than anyone suspects, possibly even before midnight." A silence followed. Hastings exhaled. So the alibis crumble. Poirot gave a grave nod. "Oui, because if the time is false, then those who claimed to be asleep or elsewhere may not be as innocent as they seemed." A knock interrupted them. Denner entered pale. "Monsieur Poirot, pardon, but I thought you should know. There's been a disturbance in the luggage room." "Go on," Poirot said. "One of the trunks belonging to Madame Romilly was found pried open, and inside was something we did not expect." "What?" Hastings asked. Denner swallowed. "A woman's robe, burgundy silk, torn and stained with blood." Poirot was already moving toward the door. Then, at last, he said quietly, "The curtain begins to rise." Chapter 7. The burgundy robe lay draped across the polished table in Denner's office, an incongruous burst of silk and violence in a room designed for order. Blood had dried into the collar, dark, rusted, nearly brown now, but unmistakable. A single tear marred the left sleeve near the elbow, as though it had snagged on something in haste. Poirot stood over it, unmoving. Hastings behind him shifted uncomfortably. "It's the one Beatrice mentioned," he said. "The robe Madame Vernier wore before retiring. But if it's blood-stained—" Denner cleared his throat, anxious. "We found it in a compartment at the bottom of Madame Romilly's trunk. She'd already checked out early this morning. Her room is empty, no forwarding address." Poirot remained silent. His gaze was not on the robe, but on the stains. How they clustered near the neckline, how they followed no typical pattern of a self-inflicted wound. "Too high for a fall," he murmured. "Too centralized for a careless accident. This was no minor injury." He turned abruptly. "Have you checked Madame Romilly's room thoroughly?" Denner looked startled. "Of course, twice. There was nothing else of note." Poirot gave a sharp nod. "Then we must look again, with the eyes, not the hands." Room 10 bore the same ornate luxury as the others. Thick carpets, velvet drapes, furniture that whispered wealth. But Poirot moved through it as if through a stage, testing corners, observing dust patterns, aligning shadows. Near the fireplace, he stopped. Aha! Beneath the edge of the hearthrug, he withdrew a silver cufflink, distinctive, masculine, with a thin enamel stripe of forest green. Not something a woman would wear, nor something likely to be dropped without notice. He held it up to Hastings. Our mysterious visitor, perhaps. Hastings squinted. "Do you think Romilly was working with someone?" Poirot didn't answer directly. "We have a robe soaked in blood, hidden in her luggage. We have the wrong perfume used in the victim's suite. And now, a man's cufflink in her fireplace. Hastings, these are not clues. They are notes in a symphony. A melody designed to mislead." A knock at the door interrupted him. It was the maid Lisette, breathless, eyes wide. "Monsieur Poirot, come quickly. There's been another incident." The service corridor behind the kitchen was narrow, windowless, and lined with brass pipes that hissed faintly. At the end, a small door opened into the wine cellar. Lisette led them to it, her hands trembling. "I heard something, crates being moved. I thought maybe the steward was down here, but when I looked—" Poirot stepped into the dimness. A single bulb swung above, casting long, disjointed shadows. The wine cellar was cold and damp, filled with racks of dusty bottles. At the far end, a toppled crate had spilled straw across the floor, and beside it, slumped against the stone wall, was a figure. It was Emilia de Luca. Her lip was bloodied, her blouse torn at the shoulder. A bruise had begun to rise on her temple, and her left hand clutched something tightly, even as her eyelids fluttered. Poirot rushed forward. "Mademoiselle, can you hear me?" She groaned, tried to rise, then collapsed back against the wall. Hastings knelt beside her and gently loosened her grip. In her palm was a handkerchief, lace-trimmed, embroidered with the initials C.V. Celestine Vernier. Hastings whispered. Poirot looked at Lisette. "Find the doctor, now!" As the maid fled, he turned back to De Luca. "She was attacked," Hastings said. "But why? What was she doing down here?" Poirot stood slowly. His voice was soft but sharp. "She was searching for something, or perhaps someone thought she had already found it." He turned toward the dark racks of wine. What better place to hide a final clue than where no one thinks to look? 30 minutes later, De Luca was in her room under watch, sedated by the doctor and surrounded by staff. Poirot paced slowly across the now empty reading lounge, hands behind his back. "She is not the killer," he said at last, "but someone believes she knows the truth." "And the handkerchief?" Hastings asked. "A memento, or perhaps a message." He glanced toward the stairs, then the clock. "The time grows short, mon ami. The pattern sharpens. There is only one piece left I do not yet understand." Hastings frowned. "What's that?" Poirot's gaze was distant. "The why?" He turned away, but before he could speak again, Denner entered, ashen-faced. "There's a telegram for you, monsieur," he said. "Urgent. It's from the Swiss authorities. They've found a body in Lake Geneva. A man. No ID, but a passport hidden nearby." He handed the slip to Poirot. Poirot read it once, then again, more slowly. The room seemed to still around him. The name on the passport? Allard Drouet. He looked up, eyes cold. Then the ghost from Madame Vernier's past was no illusion after all. Chapter 8. By noon, the clouds had thickened over Lake Lucerne. The Grand Mirabelle's opulence felt subdued under the weight of secrets threatening to unravel. Poirot stood in the conservatory, a chamber of glass and green, where orchids thrived, and silence echoed louder than conversation. He studied a white blossom blooming in the corner, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Hastings waited near the door, glancing anxiously toward the hallway. So, it was Allard Drouet, the man Celestine feared, found dead in Geneva. Poirot nodded once, but his death was not recent. The telegram suggests he had been in the lake for at least 5 days, long before Madame Vernier's own death. But then he couldn't have killed her. Precisely. Poirot's voice was soft, tinged with something almost mournful. Yet someone used his ghost to haunt her final days, to force fear into her, fear she could not name. He turned from the orchid. And so we must ask, who knew of Drouet's history with her? Who had the means to fabricate his presence? And who benefits most from a murder that appears rooted in the past? Hastings crossed his arms. Emilia de Luca? No. Poirot shook his head. She is entangled, yes, but more the observer than the architect. He walked to the table, where a silver dish of fruit had been artfully arranged. He selected a single fig. There is something very telling about who did not run, he said. Madame Romilly vanished as soon as the investigation deepened, but Beatrice Lytton, she stayed, even after the robe was found, even after the ring was recovered. That suggests something else. Hastings frowned. Innocence? Poirot gave a slight smile. Or a desperate need to appear innocent? He placed the fig down and turned to face Hastings fully. It is time. We bring the suspects together. But not for accusation, for observation. By late afternoon, Poirot had gathered them in the Grand Salon. The vast chamber with crimson drapes, golden sconces, and a central chandelier that trembled ever so slightly whenever the wind touched the roof. Beatrice Lytton arrived first, her face pale but composed. Colonel Beauchamp entered stiffly, suspicion etched across his brow. Emilia de Luca, now bandaged but upright, took a seat without a word. Even Denner stood to the side, nervously watching the scene unfold. Poirot addressed them from the fireplace, the flickering embers behind him lending his face a theatrical glow. "You are all here," he said calmly, "because I have a matter of truth to clarify. Not guilt, truth. For in truth one finds motive, and in motive the murderer." He walked to a small side table where a perfume bottle, identical to the one found shattered in Celestine's room, now stood. This, he said, was not hers. La rose de minuit, a scent she detested, and yet it was poured around her body. Why? No one answered, Poirot continued. Because someone wished to create a scene, a portrait, a moment crafted to appear like an accident, or worse, a tragedy born of fear. He stepped closer to Beatrice Lytton. "Madame, you told me Celestine was haunted by a man from her past. You did not name him, and yet you received letters meant to manipulate her, letters invoking his presence." Beatrice's breath caught. "I didn't write them," she whispered. "No," Poirot agreed. "You did not. But someone else did. Someone who knew about Drouet. Someone who had access to the hotel ledgers and could book a room under his name. Someone who knew how to plant fear." He turned slowly, walking the arc of the room. "We assume Romilly fled to avoid suspicion, but she is not the only one with secrets buried under civility." Poirot stopped beside the piano. "And so, I leave you with a simple exercise. In 1 hour, you will each return to this room, alone. I will place this bottle of perfume on the table, and beside it, Madame Vernier's ruby ring." He held up both items, setting them in place. "One of you will not be able to resist altering the scene, to protect, to mislead, or to claim what they believe was stolen. He turned to the group, eyes like twin blades. "And I, Hercule Poirot, will be watching, not just with the eyes, but with the little grey cells." They dispersed under silence. Back in the conservatory, Poirot adjusted a small portable mirror onto the table's edge. The reflection perfectly captured the spot where the perfume and ring had been placed. He removed his pocket watch, aligning it beside the flower pot. Hastings stood beside him, tense. "You think the killer will tamper with the scene?" Poirot didn't look away from the mirror. "No, mon ami, I think the killer will reveal themselves trying to protect it." Just then, in the mirror's corner, a shadow passed through the salon, a figure, cautious, deliberate. Poirot did not speak. He merely noted the time. Chapter 9. The grand salon had been reset to perfection. Curtains drawn just enough to allow in the gold of early evening. Chairs arranged in a semicircle beneath the chandelier's pale fire. At the centre, on a round rosewood table, stood the objects, the perfume bottle of La Rose de Minuit, and the ruby ring, its fire dulled in the shadow of revelation. Poirot entered first, silent as breath, with Hastings just behind him. He paused before the table, glanced once at the mirror he'd angled subtly across the mantel, then took his position by the fireplace, where he always preferred to deliver the truth. One by one they arrived. Beatrice Lytton in a charcoal blouse, her expression unreadable. Colonel Beauchamp, frowning, cane tapping rhythmically on the floor. Emilia de Luca, her hair tightly pinned, the bandage at her temple still fresh. And finally, Albrecht Denner, pale with tension but trying to preserve the illusion of calm. Poirot did not greet them. He waited until each had taken a seat. Then he spoke. "We have arrived at the end, mes amis. Or rather, the beginning of the end. For now, we sweep aside illusion and stand face to face with truth." He moved to the table and gestured delicately. "These objects, you know. One belonged to the victim. The other was used to orchestrate her death. This morning, I left them here, unguarded, unwatched. Or so I allowed you to believe." He turned toward the mirror. "But the little grey cells? Ah, they do not sleep." Silence. A flicker of unease passed through the room. Poirot stepped forward. "Last night Celestine Vernier died, not because of passion or revenge or even fear. She died because someone constructed a scene so convincing, so elegantly tragic, that we mistook it for reality. A robe changed, a scent poured, a ring removed and replaced. Each gesture artful, calculated." He paced gently, his voice low and precise. "But what was the purpose? To mislead the police? Perhaps. To frighten someone? Possibly. But more than that, this crime was built not on impulse, but architecture, a psychological composition. The murderer did not kill in anger, they killed in fear of exposure. He stopped before Emilia de Luca. Mademoiselle, when you were attacked, what did you say you had found?" Emilia hesitated. I didn't have time to say." "But in your hand was Madame Vernier's handkerchief. You found it in the cellar, and you found something else. A note." He opened a folded page from his jacket. Its ink had smudged with damp, but the script remained legible. "You are not safe. He is already here. If I do not return by morning, burn this." Gasps filled the room. Beatrice looked away, a tremble in her shoulders. "She wrote that to me," she whispered. I never received it." Poirot nodded. "Because it was intercepted and hidden." He turned to the mirror again. At exactly 3:22 p.m. today, someone entered this room. They approached the perfume bottle. They adjusted the stopper, but they did not take the ring. He reached into his pocket and produced a photograph, grainy but clear. A figure bent slightly over the table, their back turned, the hem of a coat just visible, a pale grey hand. Poirot turned it for all to see. "Madame Lytton, you recognized the scent. You knew the ring was planted, and yet you came, not to tamper, but to protect the illusion, to preserve the narrative you helped build." Beatrice stood suddenly. "That's not true. I came because I thought someone else might tamper with it." Poirot's eyes softened. "But why fear that, unless you knew what it meant?" She looked away. "I didn't kill her." "No," Poirot said. "You did not." Another silence. And then he turned, slowly, toward the Colonel, Colonel Beauchamp. It is a curious thing, is it not, how military men so rarely misplace their accessories? The Colonel's brow furrowed. "Your cufflink," Poirot said, "found in room 10's fireplace, beside a patch of rose ash." Beauchamp straightened, but his fingers curled tightly around the top of his cane. "I have no idea how it got there." "No? And yet you were the one who escorted Madame Romilly to her suite, were you not? You claimed to have returned to bed, but Madame de Luca saw you again, later, near the stairs, holding a handkerchief." Beauchamp did not respond. Poirot moved closer. "And the blood on the robe, found in Madame Romilly's trunk. That robe belonged to Celestine. The stain on the collar came from a defensive wound, not hers, but the attacker's. A scratch inflicted by a ring." He raised the ruby ring in the light. The skin beneath the gem was chipped. The scratch, recent. I wondered who had a matching wound. Poirot's gaze dropped to the Colonel's neck, just above the collar. A faint scar, newly scabbed. The room was breathless, and then Beauchamp spoke, low, hollow. She said she would expose me, that she remembered everything. Poirot's tone was gentle now. "You knew her in Paris, before the war, when you were not yet a colonel, but a man with secrets." I thought she was bluffing. Beauchamp's eyes shimmered. She wasn't. She never forgot. Not any of it. Poirot placed the ring on the table. "She did not die for love, Colonel. She died because memory is sharper than forgiveness." Beauchamp sat back in his chair, but Poirot did not step away. Instead, he turned very slowly toward Emilia de Luca. "And yet," he said softly, "there is still one question unanswered." Her eyes locked on his. "And it is you, mademoiselle, who holds the final key." Chapter 10. All eyes turned to Emilia de Luca. She did not flinch. Her spine remained straight, her gaze steady. Yet Poirot, ever the reader of human detail, saw the tremble in her fingertips as she rested them on her lap, the way her breath briefly stalled when he uttered those last words. "You say I hold the key," she said. "To what, monsieur?" Poirot moved with unhurried grace to the salon doors and closed them with a gentle click. The room tightened. The chandelier above flickered slightly, as if the light itself anticipated a revelation. "To motive, mademoiselle," Poirot replied, and to intention. Colonel Beauchamp committed the act, yes, but it was not his plan. It was not his orchestration. That required precision, timing, emotionally informed manipulation. You, Emilia, were the architect of the fear that broke Madame. Vernier. Gasps whispered through the salon like wind through dry leaves. Emilia blinked. Her lips parted. That's absurd. Poirot stepped closer. Is it? You arrived at the Mirabelle 3 weeks ago. Alone, unannounced. You made yourself useful, charming, observant, and from the moment you met Madame Vernier, you watched, you listened, and you saw what others had missed. He turned to the others. Celestine Vernier had lived under the shadow of trauma. The details were never public, but the man she once fled, Allard Drouet, was known for his entanglements. It is now evident that one of those entanglements resulted in a child, a daughter, hidden, raised in silence. Poirot returned his eyes to Emilia. I found the application to the Grand Mirabelle staff records. Your name was not De Luca until recently. Before that, Emilia Vernier. A shiver passed through the room. Poirot pressed on, voice velvet smooth but unrelenting. You came here not as a guest, but as a test, to see if she would recognize you. But she didn't, not fully. She treated you kindly, yes, but as a stranger. And that hurt, did it not? You had imagined something else, reunion, acknowledgement, but instead you remained invisible. Emilia stood now, slowly. Her voice was calm, but glassy. You think I wanted revenge? No, Poirot said gently. Not at first. I think you wanted the truth. But when it did not come, when she continued to live a life so polished, so beautifully composed, you decided to rewrite the story. Poirot retrieved a final object from his coat pocket. A photograph, brittle with age. A young woman, Celestine, unmistakably, holding an infant wrapped in lace. This was found tucked behind a dresser in your room, hidden. Emilia's lips thinned. She gave me away. I was nothing but a scandal. She pretended I never existed. You do not deny it? She looked directly at Poirot. No. Poirot's voice softened. You used Beatrice's trust, her affection. You guided her to plant the rose perfume, to change the robe. You left her letters to deliver, signed only with fear. You wanted Celestine to feel the presence of the man who haunted her life, and in her panic, she turned to the wrong person. His eyes met Colonel Beauchamp's. He was already under pressure. Madame Vernier had spoken to him privately, threatened to expose their past. He thought he was cornered. But you, Mademoiselle, gave him the means, the wine, the message, the moment. You created a stage, and he stepped into it. Emilia's posture stiffened. Her voice, when it came, was bitterly quiet. She deserved to feel what it's like to be erased, to live in fear of a knock on the door, to know someone is watching from the dark. Poirot was silent for a moment. And so, he said finally, and you did not kill her with poison, or blade, or even your own hand. You killed her with the weapon she once used on you, absence. Emilia exhaled, her composure shattered, not in rage, but in grief. She dropped into the armchair behind her and covered her face with both hands. No words, just silence. A silence more condemning than any outburst. Colonel Beauchamp, pale and trembling, looked at her. not with anger, but with recognition. A man who had also been guided by his own silence into ruin. Poirot stood still, letting the quiet settle. The truth had landed, not with drama, but with irrevocability. Hastings whispered, "Will they both be arrested?" Poirot did not answer. Instead, he walked to the window and drew back the curtain. Outside, the fog had lifted. The lake was still. "The law will do what it must," he said at last, "but it will not bring back what was lost long ago." He turned back to the room, eyes scanning the stunned faces, the fading tension, the sadness that hung heavier than guilt. "There remains only one thing left to say," Poirot murmured. He picked up the perfume bottle. "And it is not mine to speak." Chapter 11. The following morning, the Grand Mirabelle was quieter than it had been in days. The air was still, and yet there was an unease in the silence, as if the hotel itself were reluctant to resume normalcy. Guests spoke in hushed tones, some already packing their things, while the staff moved with the stilted caution of people unsure whether the storm had passed, or merely paused. In the hotel's conservatory, Poirot sat at a wrought-iron table, stirring a fresh cup of chocolate. Hastings joined him a moment later, newspaper folded under his arm, his expression still shadowed by the weight of the night before. "They've taken Colonel Beauchamp into custody," he said. "Swiss police arrived early this morning. They say he'll be tried here. Murder, conspiracy, obstruction, likely to spend the rest of his life behind bars." Poirot gave a small nod, not looking up from his cup. "And Madame de Luca? She's still in her room. The police questioned her, of course. She admitted her role. But since she didn't physically commit the murder, they say she may only face charges of obstruction and psychological manipulation." Hastings's voice dropped. "She may walk free, Poirot. Can you believe it?" Poirot finally looked up, his eyes unreadable. "She may walk," he said, "but she will not be free." Hastings frowned. "What do you mean?" Poirot placed his spoon down with meticulous care. "There are punishments, Hastings, which no judge can inflict. To see one's bitterness realized, to orchestrate vengeance so perfectly, only to find that it does not ease the ache it was meant to heal, that mon ami is its own prison." They sat in silence for a moment, the scent of orchids drifting through the glass house. "She never wanted her mother dead," Poirot added. "Not truly. She wanted to be seen, to be claimed. But when that did not come, she rewrote the final chapter." Hastings shook his head. "So much deception, and all of it for, what, closure?" Poirot sighed. "Closure is a myth, Hastings. There is only truth, and the burden of knowing it." Just then, Denner approached, looking older than he had 2 days prior. The stress had etched new lines into his face. "Monsieur Poirot," he said softly, "there's something you should know. Madame de Luca checked out an hour ago. She left no forwarding address." Poirot was not surprised. He simply nodded. "She will not go far. The past always follows, even when we pretend we've outrun it." As Denner left, Poirot reached into his jacket and withdrew a small envelope. He handed it to Hastings. "Post this, will you? It's addressed to Beatrice Lytton." Hastings glanced at the name, then raised an eyebrow. "You think she'll stay here after everything?" "No," Poirot said, "but I think she deserves to know the truth." He paused. She did not plant the perfume, Hastings, nor did she switch the robe. She was manipulated, as so many were. But in the end, it was her loyalty to Celestine that kept her silent, and her loyalty to the idea of justice that led her to help me. Poirot sipped his chocolate, eyes distant now. Lytton was the only person who knew Celestine not by reputation or fame or history, but as a woman, flawed, fragile, brave. Hastings leaned back. "And now she's alone, so are many," Poirot said quietly. He stood brushing the creases from his jacket. "There is one final thing we must see before we leave." The lake was still, its surface catching the pale light of late morning. Poirot and Hastings walked the garden path slowly until they reached the rosebush beneath the window of Suite 7. There, nestled among the blooming red flowers, was a single ribbon, red silk, tied neatly in a bow. Hastings knelt. She came back. Poirot nodded, and she left her grief behind, as it should be. He reached out, untied the ribbon, and held it for a moment in his palm. "There is a tragedy in this story, yes," he said softly, "but also something else. A woman tried to silence the past. Another tried to make it scream. But in the end, both failed. Because truth, Hastings, does not stay buried. It grows, like a rose through stone." They stood in silence for a moment, the air cool, the lake stretching endless before them. Then Poirot turned, the ribbon still folded gently in his hand. "One last task," he said, "and then home." Chapter 12. The train from Lucerne to Geneva moved with quiet precision through the snow-capped Swiss countryside. Inside their private compartment, Poirot sat opposite Hastings, a blanket folded neatly across his knees, his gloves resting beside a modest stack of letters. His eyes were half closed, not in slumber, but in reflection, the kind that travelled deeper than the rail lines beneath them. Hastings, as ever, was less at peace. He'd been staring out the window for half an hour, but not once had he commented on the view. At last he spoke. "Do you think she'll write back?" Poirot didn't ask whom he meant. He already knew. "No," he said gently, "but that is not why I wrote to her." Hastings turned to him. "I can't help but wonder, Poirot, if Celestine had simply acknowledged Amelia, told the truth from the beginning, could all of this have been avoided?" Poirot opened his eyes fully. "Perhaps. But, mon ami, that is the great tragedy of humanity. We build walls of silence around shame, hoping it will protect us. And when the truth finally climbs over, it often does so with a knife." He folded his hands across his chest. "You see, Hastings, we speak often of guilt and justice. But there is another word that lingers at the heart of every crime." He paused, letting the rhythm of the train fill the silence. "Loneliness," Hastings frowned. "Loneliness?" Poirot nodded. Madame Vernier carried a secret for decades, a daughter hidden, a chapter of her life excised like a tumour. She told herself it was mercy, that she was sparing the child's scandal, but what she truly feared was the vulnerability of being known completely. Hastings spoke softly. "And Emilia?" She was raised without answers, without love. When she found her mother again, she did not want revenge at first. She wanted to be seen. But when that moment failed her, when the woman she had dreamed of for years treated her as a stranger. It ignited something far worse than hatred, resentment, Hastings said. Worse still, Poirot replied, emptiness. The train curved along a river. A church bell rang faintly through a nearby village, the sound vanishing into the glass. Poirot leaned forward, his voice more contemplative now. There is a danger, Hastings, in stories left unfinished. They ferment, twist. People fill the silence with their own inventions until those fictions become more real and more dangerous than the truth ever was. Hastings shifted in his seat. And what of Colonel Beauchamp? You think he was manipulated entirely? Poirot's gaze darkened. He made his choice. Let us not forget that. Emilia built the theatre, but Beauchamp stepped willingly into the role. He feared scandal more than murder. That is the hallmark of a coward. He adjusted his pocket square, then added more softly, but perhaps he too was haunted by an earlier failure. Men like him carry their shame beneath medals and moustaches, until one day it spills out. A moment passed. Poirot reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the red silk ribbon. It had been pressed carefully, folded with precision. He looked at it now, not with sentimentality, but with the clinical reverence he reserved for things that told the truth without speaking. Hastings watched him. Will you keep it? Poirot shook his head. Nah, I will leave it at the church in Geneva. Perhaps someone will take it, perhaps not, but its meaning belongs to no one now. They sat in silence for some time. Finally, Poirot broke it. You know, mon ami, people often assume the detective's role is to deliver justice, to right wrongs, but they are mistaken. Hastings tilted his head. Then what is our role? Poirot smiled faintly. To understand. He looked out the window as the landscape shifted, mountains giving way to flat, open fields, white with late-season frost. Justice, he said, is a blunt instrument, but understanding, that is the scalpel, and it cuts to the heart of every crime. The train whistle blew in the distance. The city drew near. Poirot closed his eyes again, the red ribbon still in his hand. People lie with words, Hastings, but they lie most cleverly with silence. And this time, Hastings had no reply, only the sound of the train and the story they would carry with them long after the tracks had ended.